have it. Yeah. Okay, so can you see the slides? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I work at the University of Gajah Mada, which is the poster child for the World Mosquito Program, because the research which led to the Yogyakarta case study, which they used to persuade the World Health Organization to make this a global program, was conducted in Yogyakarta. Nature Medicine hailed Uda Witarini, professor at UGM, responsible for the program as a mosquito commander, which is a very strange phrase. She does not command the mosquitoes. They have been released in the community where they have bred. And the idea is that they will outbreed the existing mosquitoes, outcompete, and eventually they will replace the existing mosquitoes. And we do not know the long-term consequences of creating a monoculture of mosquitoes in Georgia. However, the World Mosquito Program, which is primarily funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, including in Indonesia, they have an office in Yogyakarta. They claim that eventually this program in relation to dengue and increasing the numbers of Aedes aegypti around the world that have been modified in the laboratory is the only way to tackle dengue. And they claim that it must be done and it must go nationwide and global, ultimately, at a huge cost, as you can see there, between 4 and 9 billion. They have the scientific journals on their side, but we've all seen this before, of course. They only report one side. Nature, in particular, seems to be a very controlled journal these days, but it explains the strategy. And the idea is that the Wolbachia bacteria, which are commonly found in other insects, for example, in fruit flies, are transmuted by microinjection and genetic breeding into Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, and the Wolbachia bacteria is supposed to outcompete the dengue pathogen. So enabling Aedes aegypti mosquito to basically wipe out. They become like a biocide or a pesticide, and they wipe out other mosquitoes that might hand on the dengue infection. There are a number of papers now claiming success for the Yogyakarta project, including this one, funded, noted by the Javanese Foundation, and the trial results are that they successfully established this Wolbachia containing mosquito throughout the Yogyakarta area. And then the New England Journal of Medicine published a study based on a pilot study in which it was said that individuals in the pilot areas where the Wolbachia mosquito were released had a 77% lower dengue infection in their blood than individuals outside those areas. And there were also newspaper reports that the number of hospitalizations for dengue had reduced, and these reports linked this reduction with the program. However, there are a number of curious statistical features to the rates of dengue infection in Yogyakarta in the last 20 years. This shows a pretty modest rate of dengue cases until 2009. But in the year immediately preceding the start of the program, there was a very, very sudden increase of 2.5 times, and more than that, 3 times of the mean, which is unexplained. Furthermore, immediately before the release of the embryos into the community at a large scale, which took place in 2016, there was another huge jump in dengue infections and cases. And then, as you can see, this jump after the release of these embryos, you then see a steep decline back to normal levels. And then in 2018 to 2019, another unexplained jump. Now, I have questions. I'm in the humanities, but I have questions as a professor of ethics about these projects. Why did the infections increase 2.5 times before the project began? Why do scientists who claim this huge success rate in relation to dengue infections not discuss the anomalous increase in dengue infection, both in 2011 and again immediately prior to the pilot study in 2015-16? I wonder if traditional control methods were reduced to improve the outcomes? Of course, this is just a question. I'm not saying it was done, but it's a question that I have. But of course, the success, allegedly, of the Wolbachia mosquito program in Yogyakarta is used as a justification for massive releases of Wolbachia mosquitoes in other parts of Asia, including now in Singapore, where again there's been a big uptick in dengue infection during the program, in Sri Lanka, where there's been a tripling of cases in the last 2 years, and now in Bali and Central and West Java. As we've seen from Professor Richard's slides also, the plan is West Nusa Tenggara and all the way to Sulawesi. Well, the difficulty is from a publicity and scientific journal point of view, that if you go online and you search for World Mosquito Program, you find a huge raft of publicity saying success, reduced. All the reports are, nearly all the reports online are that dengue has gone down everywhere WMP has operated. But this is actually not the case when you look at the statistics. So we all know that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have huge investment in marketing, publicity, and in mainstream print and online media. In the UK, where I'm from, Bill and Melinda Gates fund the BBC and The Guardian, two of the most influential outlets in the UK. But there are also ecological questions about the World Mosquito Program. The scientists claim that these modified bacteria are natural, but of course they're not natural. Wolbachia bacteria do not normally occur in Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. Male Wolbachia embryos are modified by microinjection to infect adult mosquitoes with the bacteria. And then in the laboratory, the scientists select only for those insects which endure with the Wolbachia bacteria in them. In other words, they create a genetically modified species, which they're not owning up to in their publicity. And this, I think, is highly, highly problematic. These are genetically modified organisms by a range of techniques associated with CRISPR, Cas9 gene editing, which was invented in Australia. And of course, the first creation of Wolbachia mosquitoes was also in Australia by the Australian government, CSIRO, and Monash University. The massive releases of the modified mosquitoes are intended to outcompete unmodified mosquitoes. In my view, this is a covert gene drive. In other parts of the world, using different technology, gene drives in Florida, in New York City, in Brazil, have led to outbreaks of infant encephalitis in Brazil and Zika. And now they even have malaria in New York City for the first time in 100 years, and they have Zika in Florida, and dengue, and they never had it before. So, yeah, these are just two papers for those who are interested in looking at the science on the use of genetic control techniques in these World Mosquito Program projects. They call them these mosquito symbionts because they are not that. They are engineered. Well, this, briefly moving on, is the Sri Lanka program, began in 2021. The publicity there from the World Mosquito Program, it was in Colombo primarily, and then later they will release into other areas. As you can see, they started releasing them in 2020, and then 3 years later, we see dengue cases in Sri Lanka, including in Colombo, have gone up 3 times. And this is a number of media reports, not only just one rogue outlet. There are many reports online of significant increases in mosquitoes. So, Jogja, Sri Lanka and Singapore, and then, for the reasons we do not understand, as Professor Klaproth has said, Bali is next chosen. And there's a huge amount of publicity online, again, from the World Mosquito Program. They've begun community engagement in Bali in 2022, and they've begun the marketing campaign. There are even people on Facebook working for World Mosquito Program who are going up against people in Bali who are concerned about its program, saying you don't need to be worried, it's all going to be wonderful, and it's all going to be good for your health, and so on, and it's not genetically modified. It's quite clear that the Gates Foundation are funding the marketing because they have the kind of people who can do this. Well, there are a number of things we do know about the Bali mosquito program, as Richard has already shared some of these. The releases are due from tomorrow into households, November the 13th. We know that the mosquito species, Aedes aegypti, are more resistant to pesticides than other species, and those are the species that are going to be incubated and released into households in North and South Bali. And in order for these mosquitoes to breed into larger numbers to outcompete the other mosquitoes, they must, of course, breed via the blood of Balinese people. That is the plan. Essentially, the people in Bali become the lab rats for this project. And we have also learned in our network that a commonly used detergent for reducing the chances of larvae growing in standing water or in drains and so on in the rainy season, abate, is less widely available now than it was before the start of the program. We're still looking into that. We don't know who or why that chemical has been made more difficult to obtain. We've also discovered, and Professor Klaproth discovered this, that the Coordination Authority in Jakarta has not given permission for a release of this new species for health reasons in Bali. And we've asked, therefore, that the program be stopped. And we've approached a number of people in Indonesia to have the program stopped. As in Yogyakarta, the consultation was confined to the areas where it is planned to incubate the larvae. They did not consult Yogyakarta-wide, and they did not consult Bali-wide. But everybody in Bali ultimately is going to be impacted if all of the Balinese mosquitoes become Aedes aegypti or Bactria strain mosquitoes. Everyone will be impacted, and yet people are not being asked. I've been working on genetic engineering since 1996. I know Ian Wilmot. I was in a research team with him on the ethics of genetic engineering based in Edinburgh. The first cloned mammal was created by Ian Wilmot in Edinburgh in the agricultural school associated with the University of Edinburgh, where I worked for 27 years. Later, I co-wrote a study of the impacts of genetic engineering in the countries of Brazil, India, and Mexico, and we found huge, unanticipated negative impacts and costs of genetic engineering of agricultural crops in all three of these countries. And yet, when I was working on the book Engineering Genesis, the scientists all assured me that my concerns about the potential risks of this novel engineering were unwarranted. In fact, the study that I co-produced in 2017 clearly shows that they were warranted. The World Mosquito Program Bali then program carries with it a number of risks as well as potential benefits. There is only at the moment one peer-reviewed risk assessment of Wolbachia mosquito mass releases. It is non-empirical. It's not even based on a lab experiment. It is purely based on a computerized Bayesian model and finds no significant risks on any aspect of the Wolbachia mass release as proposed for Bali and as already conducted in Jogja. So therefore, in fact, we do not know the risks of a massive release of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in Bali any more than we knew them in Yogyakarta. Experience with agricultural genetically modified organisms indicates that it is likely that the novel mosquito monoculture to be created in Bali and already in Jogja will eventually result in genetic modifications in the wild, which will produce stronger pathogens later. And because those pathogens will be in a strain of mosquitoes more resistant to traditional control methods than existing species, they will in the future quite likely represent a greater health threat than dengue, which, as Professor Klaproth has pointed out, has very low mortality in Indonesia now as a result of traditional methods of control. But the final question to me and to many in Bali is, what are the cultural as well as ecological impacts of a heritable and transmissible novel genetic trait in Bali's mosquito population on the 1,000-year-old UNESCO-recognized World Heritage rice-growing system, which is called in Bali Subak. And I'm going to end with a few slides about that. Bali was subjected to a science-informed new set of technologies in the 1970s associated with the Green Revolution by agricultural engineers from Switzerland, with the full approval of the agricultural experts in Jakarta. It was called the Bali Irrigation Project. The scientists told Balinese rice farmers to abandon centuries-old temple-governed traditions of rice growing and irrigation. Each farmer was told to plant the new fast-growing hybrids at will, regardless of what their neighbors were doing, and to ignore the advice of the temple priests on sharing water. Problems with the Bali irrigation project included pests, plagues, droughts, and resulted in declines in rice production. The Swiss engineers responded with more technologies, other seeds, more agrochemicals, and so on and so forth. They introduced new cement weirs as well, and yet the droughts and the pest plagues continues. The engineers who introduced these techniques knew nothing of the evolved ways in which the culture and religion of Bali distributed the water on Bali, sustained cooperation between farmers, and so controlled pests. They dismissed the culture of Bali, the agricultural techniques, as a rice cult and as superstition, and they forced farmers by fines and regulations to abandon centuries-old traditions and take up new methods. Because they lost so much rice production, they started getting more pests and droughts. The Balinese farmers started to campaign for a return to the water temple control planting and harvesting of rice. This was dismissed by the scientists as religious conservatism, but they did eventually call in Balinese academics at Udayana University in Denpasar. Udayana University is also involved in the Bali mosquito project. The scientists found that a result of the policy of continuous, uncoordinated rice planting was the reason for the problems with rice growing in Bali during the Bali irrigation project. And they recommended further investigation of connections between the hierarchy of the Subak temples and cropping patterns. The anthropologist Stephen Lansing was doing field work in Bali at the time, and he wrote a report for the Asia Development Bank, in which he said the rituals of the temples were not a template for an outmoded cultivation system, but a system of ecological management with deep historical roots in Balinese agriculture. Agriculture was a social as well as a technical process, dependent on hydraulic solidarity achieved by the temple system. Continuous rice cropping threatened both the ecology of the terraces and the social infrastructure of production. Lansing concluded in his book on the same topic, Priests and Programmers, the substitution of the high-tech and bureaucratic solution in the event proved counterproductive and was the major factor behind the yield and crop area declines experienced between 82 and 85. The cost of the lack of appreciation of the merits of the traditional regime has been high. Project experience highlights the fact that the irrigated rice terraces of Bali form a complex artificial ecosystem recognized locally over centuries. But the idea of religion playing an important role in agriculture, or we might also say in health, was inconceivable to development planners and scientists. Eventually, however, the Swiss engineers and the Jakarta bureaucrats had to admit that what they dismissed as a water cult of Bali was more effective in growing rice than their scientific techniques. They left behind in Bali, however, depleted soils, hybrid seeds, artificial fertilizers, new concrete weirs, but they did give up the attempt to replace the water temples and the priests in the running of Bali's Sawa. But the failure of the project, the triumph of the Subak system, demonstrates that what Western scientists and Jakarta bureaucrats dismiss as magic is a real energetic force field and was more effective over hundreds of years than the science-informed techniques. It does not only comprise or influence religious and ethical relationships, but reaches beyond human consciousness and society to influence the more than human world. Bali has a religio-cultural, spiritual set of traditions deeply implicated in the growing of food and in the health of the people, in the provision of water, all the way from the mountain, Gunung Agung, to the sea. Mosquitoes grow in water. This is a genetic engineering of a 1,000-year-old UNESCO-recognized heritage project island. And the Balinese, the priests who control that system, not the scientists, have not even been consulted whether they want that system engineered yet again for alleged health purposes, just like the last project was allegedly to improve rice yields and to improve people's health. Well, through a social media campaign, which has been resourced by some amazing people in Bali, including not least Professor Richard Klaproth, and a number of expatriates and Balinese. Questions are now being asked in newspapers about this program. The program has spread in Bahasa, Indonesia, and in English. Concerns about the program on the island, more Balinese as well as foreigners are expressing concern, and online petitions have been begun. In essence, we in what we call the Bali Solidarity campaign wish that the government and the scientists would not use Bali, or indeed the rest of Indonesia, for this program. We want it stopped. Thank you very much.
Very good, Michael. What's this?
Yeah, hi Francis. I think you can, yeah, there you have it.